Welcome to Mythology Matters, where ancient narratives unfold a profound connection between history, theology, and mythology. Balor of Evil Eye, the weaponized gaze of destruction. Before the nuclear age, before the invitation of the laser, and before the world knew the terror of modern weaponry, there was a bar of Fomorians perched upon the jagged cliffs of Torre Highlands. This primordial tyrant held a power so volatile it was kept behind 7 layers of iron and leather. When those lids were raised, it didn't just kill, it animated the world. This is the story of the evil eye, a gaze that turned a fertile land to salt and armies to ash. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the darker corner of Irish mythology. Your support keeps these ancient legends alive. Chapter 1. The shadow of Torre Island. The North Atlantic does not merely meet the northern coast of Ireland. It wages an internal war against it. At the vanguard of this conflict stands Torre Highland, a jagged, desolate splinter or grante rising from the churning foam of the Donegal coast. To the modern traveler, it is a place of rugged beauty and isolation. But in the primordial memory of the world, it was the unfeasted citadel of the Fomorians. The Celtic, monstrous precursors to the gods, and atop the iced cliff, where the salt spray freezes into crust of white brine, stood the tower of their king, Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor was not a king in the sense of gold crowns and silken robes. He was a force of nature given a terrifying general form. His skin was the color of blushed sky, weathered by centuries of gale force, winds, and the toxic vapor of the underworld. He was a giant among giants, but his physical stature was dwarfed by the seismic weight of presence. To look upon Balor was to feel the heat of dying star of the cold vacuum of an empty grave. At the center of his forehead sat the anatomical anomaly that defined his reign, the eye. It was not a window to the soul, but a furnace of entropic energy. The eye was massive. Its eyelash, a swirling vortex of jaundice, yellow and blood red, pulsing with a light that felt like a physical blow to the chest. It was so potent, so inherently lethal, that Balor could not leave it open. To do so would be to incinerate his own kingdom, to turn the very stones of Torre into glass, and to see into boiling cauldron of steam. Instead, the eye was kept shattered behind 7 heavy layers of specialized hide, the skin of ancient beasts, treated with iron and ready to dampen the radiation of his gaze. It was said that the weight of these lids was so immense that it took 4 Fomorian warriors, their muscles straining and their heels digging into the earth, to hoist them upward using great iron hooks and pulleys. The origin of this weaponized anatomy was a tale of accidental horror. In his youth, Balor had been curious. a trait that usually leads to wisdom, but for a Fomorian, ready only to reign. He had spied upon his father's druids as they brewed a concoction of the world's venoms, a slurry of nightshade, dragon's bile, and the concentrated essence of Lot. As the steam rose from the cauldron, it carried the molecular weight of death itself. A single plume of this vapor drifted into Balor's eye. It did not blind him in the traditional sense. It transformed his vision. It fused his sight with fundamental power of decay. From that moment on, what Balor saw him unmade. Life of Tory Island under Balor's rule was a study in eternal and absolute hierarchy. The Fomorians were not unified people, but a collection of disparate, often deformed entities, some with heads of gods, others with multiple limbs, all bound together by the singular fear of their king's gaze. They lived in the shadow of his tower, and the structure built of basalt blocks so large they seemed moved by giant hands. The tower served a dual purpose. It was a throne for the king and a prison for his daughter Ethelyn. Ethelyn was a tragic paradox of Balor's life. She was beautiful, carrying the grace of the sea's calmer moments, but to Balor, she was ticking clock. A prophecy had been whispered by a druid, a prophecy that had taken root in Balor's mind like a malignant tumor. It stated that he would be slain by his own grandson. In the twisted logic of the Fomorian king, the solution was simple. Ethelyn would never know a man. He looked her in the high tower of the Tromau, guarded by the 12 matrons who were sworn to silence and vigilance. He believed he could outrun fate by isolating the vessel of his destruction. However, the world outside Tory Island was changing. The Tuatha de Danann, the people who the goddess Dan had arrived in Ireland. They were the architects of order, the masters of song, craft, and bringing magic. They represented everything the Fomorians loathed. Where the Fomorian were the storm, the Tuatha de Danann were the arts. Where Balor was the drought, they were the rain. Balor watched the mainland from his high perch, his one good eye, the smaller, shaman eye, fixed on the distant green hills. He could feel the shift in the spiritual tide. The Tuatha de Danann were building a civilization of light, and the existence of such light was an insult to the darkness of Tory. He began to plan. He would not just defeat these newcomers. He would erase them. He would wait for the moment when their armies were gathered, when their hopes were highest, and then he would order his warriors to lift the 7 reeds. He spent his days pacing the battlements, the wind whipping his matted hair. He was a king of silence. He rarely spoke, for his voice was like the grinding of tectonic plates. His power was his presence. He was the shadow of Tory Highland. A darker sun that refused to set. He looked down at the freezing waters below, watching the Fomorian longships, vessels made of darker wood and bone, patrolling the straits. They were the scavengers of the sea, bringing back a tribute and captives, but to Balor they were mere distraction. He was waiting for the inevitable. He knew that prophecies were not easily broken, but he possessed a weapon that defied the laws of gods and men. He felt the harm of the evil eye behind its laser shrouds, a constant low-frequency vibration that rattled his skull. It was a hunger. The eye wanted to see. It wanted to consume the vibrant greens of the mainland and turn them into the grey of ash. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long, blood-red shadow across the Atlantic, Balor stood at the edge of the cliff. He was a personification of the world's end. In his mind, he saw the faces of Tuatha the Danann, the smith's god Goibniu, the healer Dian Cheket, and the king Nwada. They were ephemeral, like the form of the waves. Only the Fomorians were eternal, for they were the bedrocks of the world cruently. Let them build, he might have whispered, his breeze smelling of sulfur and old salt. Let them sow their seeds and sing their songs. When the leaves rises, there will be no one left to remember their names. And so the shadow deepened. The island of Troy became a black silhouette against a darkening sky, a fortress of spite waiting for the spark that would ignite the final war for Ireland. The king retreated into his tower, passing the unbound door of his daughter's prison without a word, climbing upward toward and peak where he could sleep and dream of a world rendered perfectly, beautifully dead. The stage was set, the players were moving into position, and the eye, the terrible, weaponized gaze of destruction, waited in the dark, pausing with the reason of the coming storm. Chapter 2. The Prophecy and the Spear. If the first era of Balor's reign was defined by the silence of the tower, the second was defined by the frantic noise of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The prophecy that a grandson would be his undoing had transformed from a distant threat into a cold, parasitic lot of the center of Balor's mind. He had done the impossible. He had imprisoned the future. Etherin remained in the tall ma, a ghost in the stone cage, while the 12 matrons ensured that the only faces she saw were those of her keepers. But Balor's, for all his cosmic power, misunderstood the nature of fate. He viewed it as a door that could be blotted. He did not realize it was a flood that could seep through the smallest crack in the masonry. The crack arrived in the form of haste. Across the water, on the mainland, lived a smith with the Tuatha de Danann, named Thian, who possessed a cow of such legendary fertility that she was called the grass Gaibinen. Balor, driven by a king's greed and a tyrant's desire to deprive his enemies of any spark of life, stole the beast. He lured it across all treacherous sound to Tory Island, wrathing as he tethered the source of abundance to his land of salt. But in stealing the cow, inadvertently lured the father of his destruction to his gates. Sian, aided by the dreadless Lugh, breached the impenetrable fortress not with an army but with a glamour. Disguised as a woman in need of shelter, Cian bypassed the guards and found his way into the high tower. In the dim light of the prison, where the salt air beat the lungs, the forbidden union occurred. From this intersection of Fomorian darkness and Danann lights, 3 children were born. When Balor discovered the betrayal, his fury was a physical tremor that shook the island. He ordered the infants drowned, cast into the churning whirlpools of the Atlantic. 2 were lost over deep, but one, Lugh, was caught by the dreadless Balor and spirited away to the village to Manana's Makaril, the god of the sea. Years passed like the grinding the milestone. Lugh grew not just in stature, but in versatility, while Balor was a specialist of singular. Overwhelming his destruction, Lugh became the Samridanak, the master of all arts. He was a poet, a smith, a warrior, a harper, and a king. He was the answer of the singular problem of Balor. He was complexity rising the mid-branch force of entropy. The tension between the 2 powers finally broke at the Second Battle of Magatide. The plain was a landscape of crashing ideologies. On the side of stood and the Fomorians, a wall of jagged iron and warped flesh led by Balor. On the side, the Tuatha de Danann, shining in their bronze mail, their arts blustered by the return of their champion. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the metallic tug of blood. Balor moved onto the field like a mountain coming to life. He did not run. He did not need to every stop he took crushed the spirit of men before him. At his side, the 4 reed rifters stood ready, their iron hooks grating in the pale light. They were terrified men, for they knew that if they slipped or if the wind shifted, they would be the first to be unnamed by the king's eye. Lift the leads, Balor commanded. His voice was a low, subterranean growl that silenced the din of the battle. The warrior stepped forward. The first leather shroud was peeled back, releasing a faint, sickly yellow glow. The grass at Balor's feet instantly turned to grey ash. The second and third shrouds flowed, and low hum began to vibrate through the air. A sound like a 10,000 hornet nest disturbed at once. The 4th and 5th layers were hoisted, and the sky itself seemed to bruise, the clouds coloring into a dark, oily purple. Lugh stood across the field, a lone figure in the path of a coming storm. In his hand, he held no shield. Instead, he gripped the spear of Asur, a weapon of divine craftsmanship that never missed its mark and always returned to the hand of its wielder. Lugh knew he could not survive a direct hit from the eye. No god or mortal could. He had to strike in the microsecond between the lifting of the final lead and the release of the beam. 6. Balor roared, and penultimate ray fell away. The heat was now intolerable. Warriors on both sides began to retreat, their skin blistering from the mere proximity of the unsheathed divinity. Lugh began to spin his sling, the stone within it humming a counter melody to the eye's vibration. He closed his own eyes for a moment, centering himself not on the giant before him, but on the tiny, paralyzing target behind the last layer of leather. He was the long arm of the justice, the precision of the craftsman against the chaos of the beast. 7. As the final lid was yanked upward, the world seemed to hold its breeze. The evil eye opened fury, a sun of pure poison, but before the beam could find its focus, before the venom of the world could bridge the gap between the king and the champion, Lugh released the stone. All in some tellings, the spear flew with the speed of a sword. It did not strike Balor's chest or his limbs. It struck at the center of the eye. The impact was not a wet thud, but a shattering crack like a crystal pillar falling on stone. The force of Lugh's throw was so immense that it drove the eye through the back of Balor's skull. For a heartbeat, the king stood frozen. He hole through his head, and then the disaster occurred. The destructive gaze, now firing from the back of his head, turned upon his own Fomorian army. The ranks of the monster were vaporized in a sweep of golden white fire. Those who had spent their lives worshipping the power of the eye were now its final victims. Balor's body, deprived of its anchor, collapsed with a sound that echoed back to the Tory Islands as his life force bred into the soil of Mag Twyed. The sky cleared, the blessed clouds dissipated, and the natural sun, the warm, life-giving sun of Lughs, shone down upon the battlefield. The reign of Fomorians was over. The era of weaponized gaze had ended, not through a great force of destruction, but through the superior application of skill. Lugh stood over the remains of his grandfather, the spear returning to his hand. Cold and silent, the prophecy had been fulfilled not by a monster, but by a master. The shadow of Tory Island had finally been shortened, and for the first time in centuries, the people of Ireland looked toward to the horizon without shielding their eyes. The legacy of Balor serves as an outing reminder that some powers are too heavy for even a god to carry. While the king of Fomorian fell at the hand of his own grandson, his shadow still lingers in every storm that batters the Donegal coast and every dot that cracks the earth. Was Balor a mere monster, or like a cosmic warning about the price of absolute destruction? As the sun set over Tory Island, the evil eye may be closed, but its impact is etched forever into the bedrock of Irish myth. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this dive, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, dive into the dark folklore of the North. Don't forget to like, subscribe, to share, and to comment. See you.